I want to be upfront about something before we even get into this one, because it's the question everyone asks me first. Losing doesn't mean German paratroopers landing in Manhattan. It doesn't mean a swastika flying over the Capitol. The United States in 1941 had a population of 130 million people, an entire ocean on either side, and an industrial base that, once it got moving, could outproduce the rest of the planet combined. Nobody was invading the American mainland. That was never the scenario on the table. But there's a version of losing that is entirely plausible, and it's a lot scarier than an invasion, because it's quieter. It's the version where the war simply doesn't end the way it actually ended. Where America fights and fights hard, and still comes out the other side of 1945 as one great power among several, rather than the single power standing at the center of the entire post-war world. That's the scenario we're building today. Not America conquered, America diminished. And once you start pulling the threads, you realize how many places this could have actually happened. Let's set the real board first, because the actual history here is more fragile than people remember. By early 1942, the war is going about as badly for the Allies as it's ever going to go. The Philippines fall to Japan in a matter of months. Singapore, supposedly Britain's impregnable fortress in the Pacific, surrendered with roughly 80,000 troops taken prisoner, the single largest capitulation in British military history. Japanese forces are moving through Burma, threatening India. In the Atlantic, German U-boats are sinking Allied shipping off the American East Coast so easily that the period gets nicknamed the Stux's Second Happy Time by U-boat crews, because American coastal cities are still lit up at night, silhouetting merchant ships perfectly for torpedo attacks. This is not a story where the good guys are cruising to an inevitable victory. This is a story where for about 18 months, absolutely nothing is guaranteed. So where's the actual hinge? I want to walk through 5 of them, because unlike a lot of these alternate history scenarios, this one doesn't come down to just one battle. It comes down to a specific sequence, and if any one link breaks, the whole chain changes. The first hinge is Midway, June 1942. This is the one everybody already half knows, but I don't think people appreciate how close it actually was. The entire Pacific War pivots on American code breakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, cracking enough of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to correctly guess that AF in Japanese communications meant Midway Island, not some other target. That single piece of signals intelligence lets Admiral Nimitz position 3 carriers exactly where the Japanese fleet doesn't expect them. American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown catch 4 Japanese carriers with their flight decks cluttered, fuel lines exposed, planes being rearmed in the span of about 6 minutes. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the force that hit Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, are sunk in a single morning. Now take that 6 minutes away. If American dive bombers arrive even 20 minutes later, after Japanese planes have launched rather than while they're still refueling on deck, the entire battle inverts. Historians who've wargamed this exact scenario consistently find the same result. American carriers get caught and sunk instead. If Midway goes the other way, the United States loses the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and Hornet, essentially the entire operational Pacific carrier force, in one afternoon, 18 months before American shipyards can realistically replace them at scale. Without carriers, there's no Pacific counteroffensive in 1942, no Guadalcanal that August, or a much more costly one fought without air cover. Japan holds a secure defensive perimeter running from the Aleutians down through the Solomons to the Dutch East Indies, sitting on the oil fields it invaded specifically to secure, and the American public is looking at a war that 8 months after Pearl Harbor appears to be going nowhere. That's not America losing the war outright. That's America staring down a Pacific conflict that could plausibly run into the 1950s rather than ending in 1945, and a public mood in Washington that starts asking very uncomfortable questions about whether a negotiated settlement with Japan, one that leaves Tokyo's Pacific Empire largely intact, might be the more realistic outcome than total victory. Second hinge, and this one gets almost no attention. The Battle of the Atlantic in early 1943. This is the actual war for the survival of Britain, more than the Blitz, more than anything happening in the skies. Britain imports the overwhelming majority of its food and fuel. If German U-boats sink merchant shipping faster than American and British shipyards can replace it, Britain simply starves, and there's no D-Day, no bomber offensive against Germany, no staging ground for anything, because there's no functioning Britain left to stage it from. March 1943 is the worst month of the entire Battle of the Atlantic for the Allies. Convoys HX-2, 29, and SC-122 lose 22 ships in a matter of days to coordinated U-boat wolf packs, and Allied planners internally calculate that shipping losses at that rate are, in their own words, unsustainable. What actually turns this around in the real timeline is a stack of technologies arriving at almost exactly the same moment. Long-range aircraft finally closing the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats had operated free of aerial attack, improved radar, and code breakers at Bletchley Park, cracking the 4-rotor Enigma variant the German Navy had switched to. Take any one of those away, delay the air gap closure by even a few months, and Britain's import capacity keeps bleeding out through the spring of 1943 rather than stabilizing. A starving blockaded Britain in mid-1943 isn't launching an invasion of France in 1944, it's negotiating. Third hinge, and the one I find genuinely the most chilling to think through, the German atomic program. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of alternate history that's most prone to overheated speculation, and the actual documented history doesn't support Germany getting a working bomb in any realistic timeline. Werner Heisenberg's team miscalculated the critical mass required for a chain reaction by a wide margin and never built a functioning reactor. An scenario worth taking seriously isn't Germany gets the bomb first. It's the much more mundane and much more plausible one: American atomic research itself stalling. The Manhattan Project succeeded partly because of an almost unrepeatable concentration of talent, resources, and urgency, driven in large part by physicists who had fled fascist Europe and were terrified, correctly, that Germany might get there first. Take away that fear, slow down that program by even a year through a different set of funding decisions or a failed early test at Los Alamos, and the war in the Pacific runs through 1946, fought entirely with conventional weapons against an increasingly fortified Japanese home island's defense. American planners were already projecting casualty estimates for a conventional invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, in numbers that ran into the hundreds of thousands on the American side alone. A war that ends that way through a brutal grinding invasion rather than 2 bombs in August 1945 is a war America technically still wins, but at a cost in American lives and Japanese civilian lives so catastrophic that the entire political character of the post-war United States looks completely different on the other side of it. Fourth hinge, and this is the one that ties everything above together: American public will itself. This is the piece people underrate the most because it doesn't show up on a battle map. Roosevelt won re-election in 1940, promising American mothers their sons would not be sent into foreign wars, and Pearl Harbor is what actually broke that political deadlock. But the Pacific and European wars combined killed over 400,000 Americans in under 4 years. Run the Midway scenario the other way, run the Atlantic scenario the other way, delay the atomic program, and you're looking at a war that could plausibly kill 2 or 3 times that number of Americans, dragging past 1945, past 1946, into a presidential election cycle where a war-weary electorate is asked, again, whether total victory is still worth the price. Democracies can lose wars of will even while they're technically still winning wars of material. That's the quiet, unglamorous way America loses this war. Not defeat, exhaustion. Fifth hinge, and it's the one furthest from American shores, but arguably the one with the biggest downstream effect: what happens to the Soviet Union while all of this is going wrong? Roughly 80% of Germany's total wartime casualties happen on the Eastern Front. That front holds barely, in part because American Lend-Lease is pouring trucks, rail engines, aircraft, and food into a Soviet war economy that's been gutted by the loss of its most productive territory. Slow down American industrial output because the country is straining to cover a worse Pacific War and a slower Atlantic crossing at the same time. And Lend-Lease shipments to Moscow don't arrive on the same schedule. A Red Army that's already absorbing the worst casualties of any combatant in the war, fighting with a thinner logistical cushion, is a Red Army that stalls somewhere further east than it actually did, maybe never reaching Berlin at all. Which means the Soviet Union comes out of this war smaller, weaker, and less politically dominant over Eastern Europe than it actually was. And that single change reshapes the entire second half of the century almost as much as anything happening to America or Germany. Historically, the United States shipped something like $11 billion worth of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. In 1940s dollars, roughly 400,000 trucks and jeeps alone, the vehicles that gave the Red Army the mobility it needed to actually encircle and destroy German armies rather than just grind them down in place, cut that pipeline by even a third, and stretch the delivery schedule by another year. And you're not looking at a Red Army that collapses. You're looking at one that wins its own war much more slowly, at an even higher cost in Soviet lives than the roughly 27 million it actually lost, and stops advancing somewhere well short of Berlin. Say Midway goes to Japan, say the Atlantic Gap holds open a few extra critical months in 1943. Say the bomb comes 18 months later than it actually did. Say Lend-Lease arrives thinner and later, and the Red Army stalls somewhere around the Polish border instead of taking Berlin. By 1945, instead of the war ending with unconditional surrenders in both Germany and Japan, you're looking at something closer to a negotiated armistice on at least one front. The most plausible version, based on how these war game scenarios tend to resolve, isn't Germany or Japan winning outright. It's a stalemate peace. Germany retains control over most of continental Europe west of a shrunken, exhausted Soviet front. Japan retains its Pacific perimeter, the resource-rich territories it invaded specifically to sustain its war economy. Indonesia's oil, Malaya's rubber, Indochina's rice. The United States, having fought an enormous and costly war, ends up as one of 3 or 4 major post-war powers rather than the single dominant one, sharing the stage with a fascist-controlled Europe, an imperial Japan sitting on the Pacific's resources, and a Soviet Union that survived but never got the chance to plant its flag over half of Europe. Now think about what doesn't exist in this world. There's no Marshall Plan rebuilding Western Europe into a network of American-aligned democracies because there's no unconditional German surrender to rebuild from. There's no United Nations built around American and Soviet co-leadership in the form we know it because the war didn't end with the kind of total Allied victory that let the post-war order get designed by the winners. There's very possibly no American nuclear monopoly for those first crucial years after the war, which means no unique American deterrent shaping the entire structure of the Cold War the way it actually did. The Bretton Woods system, the dollar, as the world's reserve currency, American troops permanently stationed across a rebuilt Western Europe and Japan, the entire architecture of the American-led post-war world, all of that assumes a decisive, total, unconditional Allied victory as its starting condition. Remove that condition and you don't get a slightly different version of the last 80 years. You get an entirely different set of load-bearing walls. There's no NATO forming in 1949 as a unified answer to a Soviet threat that swallowed half of Europe, because there's no Soviet-controlled half of Europe to answer in the first place, and instead you'd likely see a fractured, uneasy patchwork of alliances between whatever's left of free Europe, an uneasy and unresolved fascist bloc, and an America that's suddenly much less interested in permanent overseas military commitments after a war that didn't end with a clean, satisfying win to justify them. And it's not just the world stage that looks different. Walk back into American living rooms for a second, because a war that ends in exhaustion rather than triumph changes the country from the inside just as much as it changes the map. The GI Bill, the interstate highway system, the suburban housing boom, the sheer economic confidence of post-war America, all of that gets funded and justified by a nation that believes it just won the cleanest, most total victory in its history and can afford to spend accordingly. A country that instead spends 1946 and 1947 still rationing, still drafting replacement troops for occupation duties in a divided, unresolved Europe, still burying soldiers from a war that technically hasn't produced a clear winner, doesn't have the same appetite or the same treasury for that kind of domestic spending. And there's a harder edge to it too. The post-war civil rights movement drew real, documented momentum from black veterans who had fought a war explicitly framed as a fight against racial supremacy abroad and came home to demand the country live up to its own stated ideals. A war that ends in a murky, unsatisfying stalemate rather than a moral and military triumph over fascism doesn't generate that same clarity of argument, and it's entirely possible that a movement which historically gained real ground in the late 1940s and 1950s finds itself arguing from weaker footing against a country that isn't sure it just won a war for freedom at all. And here's the part that I think is genuinely the most unsettling to sit with. A world where fascist Germany and Imperial Japan survive as major unbeaten powers into the 1950s isn't a stable world. It's a world holding its breath. Both regimes were built around ideologies of continuous expansion and racial hierarchy that don't simply stop being aggressive once they've secured their initial territorial gains. A surviving Nazi Germany, having consolidated control over a devastated continental Europe, still has the entire machinery of the Holocaust running, still has ambitions toward the Soviet Union's resources, and now has years, potentially decades, without the total collapse that historically ended that machinery in 1945. That's not a footnote to this scenario, that's the actual center of it, and it's the part that any honest version of this alternate history has to sit with rather than gloss over in favor of the more comfortable geopolitical chess piece thinking. It also doesn't stay contained to Europe and the Pacific Rim. Britain and France come out of a war that ended in negotiation rather than total victory, as exhausted but not as thoroughly humbled and financially broken as they actually were. And a Britain that isn't scrambling to rebuild from total war might hold on to India, Malaya, and its African colonies a decade or two longer than it actually did, simply because the domestic political pressure and financial collapse that historically forced decolonization along on a faster timetable never lands the same way. France, similarly, might dig in harder in Indochina and Algeria, which means the wars of independence that did eventually happen in our timeline, bloody as they already were, could end up even longer and even bloodier, fought against European powers that still believe, with the fascist example sitting right next door, that empire is simply how great powers stay great. The entire wave of decolonization that reshaped Asia and Africa in the 20 and 30 years after the actual war doesn't happen the same way, on the same schedule, or with the same outcomes. And that's a ripple effect most people never even think to trace back to a 6-minute window over Midway Atoll. I keep coming back to how thin the actual margin was here. 4 Japanese carriers caught with their flight decks cluttered for a window of about 6 minutes. A handful of extra long-range aircraft closing an ocean gap a few months earlier than they otherwise might have. A research program that, by most honest accounts, could very plausibly have taken 18 more months if a dozen different funding and personnel decisions had gone slightly differently. A convoy of trucks and rail engines that either makes it to a Soviet port on schedule or doesn't. None of these are dramatic cinematic turning points. They're the small, unglamorous mechanics of an enormous war, any one of which, tipped a different way, doesn't hand the enemy a clean victory so much as it robs the actual winners of the totality of their win. That's usually the real lesson sitting underneath these scenarios. The Second World War didn't end the way it did because it had to. It ended that way because a series of narrow, specific, almost mundane advantages broke in the Allies' favor at exactly the moments that mattered most. Pull on any one of those threads, and the 20th century you're living in right now simply isn't there anymore. If hinge points like this are the reason you keep coming back to this channel, stick around, because we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis going nuclear, JFK surviving Dallas, and Pearl Harbor never happening still ahead in this series. subscribe if you want to be here when we get to them,